Chapter 3. Some Aspects of the Land. Section 1. The Simple Truth. All of us, or at least all those of my generation, heard in our youth an anecdote about George Stephenson, the discoverer of the locomotive steam engine. It was said that some miserable rustic raised the objection that it would be very awkward if a cow strayed on the railway line, whereupon the inventor replied, "It would be very awkward for the cow." It is supremely a characteristic of his age and school that it never seemed to occur to anybody that it might be rather awkward for the rustic who owned the cow. Long before we heard that anecdote, however, we had probably heard another and more exciting anecdote called Jack and the Beanstalk. That story begins with the strange and startling words, "There once was a poor woman who had a cow." It would be a wild paradox in modern England to imagine that a poor woman could have a cow. But things seem to have been different in ruder and more superstitious ages. Anyhow, she evidently would not have had a cow long in the sympathetic atmosphere of Stephenson and his steam engine. The train went forward, the cow was killed in due course, and the state of mind of the old woman was described as a depression of agriculture. But everybody was so happy in travelling in trains and making it awkward for cows that nobody noticed that other difficulties remained. When wars or revolutions cut us off from cows, the industrialists discovered that milk does not come originally from cans. On this fact, some of us have founded the idea that the cow and even the miserable rustic have a use in society, and have been prepared to concede her as much as 3 acres. But it will be well at this stage to repeat that we do not propose that every acre should be covered with cows, and do not propose to eliminate townspeople as they would eliminate rustics. On many minor points we might have to compromise with conditions, especially at first, but even my ideal, if I ever found it at last, would be what some call a compromise. Only I think it more accurate to call it a balance. For I do not think that the sun compromises with the rain when together they make a garden, or that the rose that grows there is a compromise between green and red. But I mean that even my utopia would contain different things of different types, holding on different tenures. That as in a medieval state there were some peasants, some monasteries, some common land, some private land, sorty town guilds, and so on. So in my modern state there would be some things nationalized, some machines owned corporately, some guilds sharing common profits, and so on, as well as many absolute individual owners, where such individual owners are most possible. Among the things we have heard 1,000 times is the statement that the English are a slow people, a cautious people, a conservative people, and so on. When we have heard a thing as many times as that, we generally either accept it as a truism, or suddenly see that it is quite untrue. And in this case it is quite untrue. The real peculiarity of England is that it is the only country on earth that has not got a conservative class. There are a large number, possibly a majority, of people who will call themselves conservative. But the more they are examined, the less conservative they will appear. The commercial class that is in a special sense capitalist is, in its nature, the very opposite of conservative. By its own profession it proclaims that it is perpetually using new methods and seeking for new markets. To some of us there seems to be something exceedingly stale about all that novelty. But that is because of the type of mind that is inventing, not because it does not mean to invent. From the biggest financier floating a company to the smallest tout peddling a sewing machine, the same ideal prevails. It must always be a new company, especially after what has generally happened to the old company. And the sewing machine must always be a new sort of sewing machine, even if it is the sort that does not sew. But while this is obvious of the mere capitalist, it is equally true of the pure oligarch. Whatever else an aristocracy is never conservative. By its very nature it goes by fashion rather than by tradition. Men living a life of leisure and luxury are always eager for new things. We might say fairly they would be fools if they weren't. And the English aristocrats are by no means fools. They can proudly claim to have played a great part in every stage of the intellectual progress that has brought us to our present ruin. The first fact about establishing an English peasantry is that it is establishing, for the first time in many centuries, a traditional class. The absence of such a class will be found to be a very terrible fact if the tug really becomes between Bolshevism and the historic ideal of property. But the converse is equally true and much more comforting. This difference in the quality means that the change will begin to be effective long before it is effective merely by quantity. I mean that we have not been concerned so much with the strength or weakness of a peasantry as with presence or absence of a peasantry. As the society has suffered from its mere absence, so the society will begin to change by its mere presence. It will be a somewhat different England in which the peasant has to be considered at all. It will begin to alter the look of things, even when politicians think about peasants as often as they do about doctors. They have been known even to think about soldiers. The primary case for the peasant is of a stark and almost savage simplicity. A man in England might live on the land if he did not have rent to pay to the landlord and wages to pay to the labourer. He would therefore be better off, even on a small scale, if he were his own landlord and his own labourer. But there are obviously certain further considerations, and to my mind certain common misconceptions, to which the following notes refer roughly in their order. In the first place, of course, it is one thing to say that this is desirable, and another that it is desired. And in the first place, as will be seen, I do not deny that if it is to be desired, it can hardly be as a mere indulgence is desired. There will undoubtedly be required a certain spirit of effort and sacrifice for the sake of an acute national necessity, if we are to ask any landlord to do without rent, or any farmer to do without assistance. But at least there really is a crisis and a necessity, to such an extent that the squire would often be only remitting a debt which he has already written off as a bad debt, and the employer only sacrificing the service of men who were already on strike. Still, we shall need the virtues that belong to a crisis, and it will be well to make the fact clear. Next, while there is all the difference between the desirable and the desired, I would point out that even now this normal life is more desired than many suppose. It is perhaps subconsciously desired, but I think it worthwhile to throw out a few suggestions that may bring it to the surface. Lastly, there is a misconception about what is meant by living on the land, and I have added some suggestions about how much more desirable it is than many suppose. I shall consider these separate aspects of agricultural distributism more or less in the order in which I have just noted them, but here in the preliminary note I am concerned only with the primary fact. If we could create a peasantry, we could create a conservative populace, and he would be a bold man who should undertake to tell us how the present industrial deadlock in the great cities is to produce a conservative populace. I am well aware that many would call the conservatism by coarser names, and say that peasants are stupid and stick in the mud, and tied to dull and dreary existence. I know it is said that a man must find it monotonous to do the 20 things that are done on a farm, whereas, of course, he always finds it uproariously funny and festive to do one thing, hour after hour, and day after day, in a factory. I know that the same people also make exactly the contrary comment, and say it is selfish and avaricious for the peasant to be so intensely interested in his own farm, instead of showing, like the proletarians of modern industrialism, a selfless and romantic loyalty to somebody else's factory, and an ascetic self-sacrifice in making profits for somebody else. Giving each of these claims of modern capitalism their due weight, it is still permissible to say that insofar as the peasant proprietor is certainly tenacious of the peasant property, is concentrated on the interest or content with the dullness, as the case may be, he does, in fact, constitute a solid block of private property which can be counted on to resist communism, which is not only more than can be said of the proletariat, but is very much more than any capitalists say of them. I do not believe that the proletariat is honeycombed with Bolshevism, if honey be an apt metaphor for that doctrine, but if there is any truth in the newspapers' fears on that subject, it would certainly seem that large properties cannot prevent the thing happening, whereas small properties can. As a matter of fact, all experience is against the assertion that peasants are dreary and degraded savages, crawling about on all fours and eating grass like the beast of the field. All over the world, for instance, there are peasant dances, and the dances of peasants are like dances of kings and queens. The popular dance is much more stately and ceremonial and full of human dignity than is the aristocratic dance. In many a modern countryside, the country folk may still be found on high festivals wearing caps like crowns and using gestures like a religious ritual, while the castle or chateau of the lords and ladies is already full of people waddling about like monkeys to the noises made by negroes. All over Europe, peasants have produced the embroideries and the handicrafts which were discovered with delight by artists when they had long been neglected by aristocrats. These people are not conservative merely in a negative sense, though there is a great value in that which is negative when it is also defensive. They are also conservative in a positive sense. They conserve customs that do not perish like fashions, in crafts less ephemeral than those artistic movements which so very soon cease to move. The Bolshevists, I believe, have invented something which they call proletarian art, upon which principle I cannot imagine, save that they seem to have a mysterious pride in calling themselves a proletariat when they claim to be no longer proletarian. I rather think it is merely the reluctance of the half-educated to relinquish the use of a long word. Anyhow, there never has been in this world any such thing as proletarian art, but there has most emphatically been such a thing as peasant art. I suppose that what is really meant is communist art, and that phrase alone will reveal much. I suppose a truly communal art would consist in 100 men hanging on to one huge paintbrush like a battering ram, and steering it across some vast canvas with the curves and lurches and majestic hesitations that would express in darkly outlined forms the composite mind of the community. Peasants have produced art because they were communal, but not communist. Custom and a corporate tradition gave unity to their art, but each man was a separate artist. It is that satisfaction of the creative instinct in the individual that makes the peasantry as a whole content, and therefore conservative. A multitude of men are standing on their own feet because they are standing on their own land. But in our country, alas, the landowners have been standing upon nothing except what they have trampled underfoot.